Hi, in this video, I'm going to be talking about my personal experience of living in a tiny apartment in one of the poorest areas of Japan. My name's YOODOO. I'm a musician, born in Japan, grew up in California, and now currently living in Australia. A lot of my childhood in my mid-20s was spent in Japan, so I wanted to basically share my experience of living between Australia, America, and Japan throughout my life. And I specifically wanted to share this part of my life where I was living in a tiny apartment in Japan because I think living in Japan is one of the best experiences that you can have for people watching or people thinking of living in Japan. So most of my time living in Japan was actually in the Kansai area of Japan. I mostly lived around Kansai area in my adult life. Because I was born in Katsura and Kyoto, it was a good area that I could kind of basically call home. But in this video, I'm going to be sharing one of the most memorable areas that I lived in Japan. And that area is called Shin-Imamiya. My wife and I shared a really small apartment and it was $1 DK, and every month it was 4万円, which is about currently $270 a month. And I remember whenever I'd tell my friends or coworkers or anyone that I knew that I lived in that area, they'd be shocked and actually a bit amazed. And I think that's because a lot of Japanese people specifically have a really strong image and bias towards certain parts of Japan. And the area that I lived in was stereotyped as being dirty or poor and maybe even a bit dangerous. And I think that was because there was a huge homeless population in that area. Even though Shin-Imamiya now is being gentrified, a lot of hotels are moving in, it's still seen as one of those areas that a lot of homeless people congregate. And even though there might be a bit of truth in some stereotypes, I think that living in Shin-Imamiya was probably one of my fondest memories and one of the coolest places that I lived in Japan. So I kind of want to share my experience of living there and basically tell you stories and little things that I remember of that area that kind of encapsulates the time and life that I had at that time in Japan. So the very first thing I want to talk about is the cost of living. So out of all the different places that I lived in Japan, I think that Shin-Imamiya has to hands down be one of the cheapest places that I've lived. In theory, rent and accommodation is more expensive the closer you get to Umeda, which is in the northern part of Osaka. And the place where I lived was super south. The apartment that we lived in had all the basic necessities, and it was just big enough that we can set up a little table, but nothing bigger than that. But using a futon on the floor was a necessity. And I remember my wife saying that it felt really small for her, and I'm a 6'4" big Asian guy, so it was definitely uncomfortable at times. So before we moved into our apartment, we went to a few other rooms checking it out with the real estate agent. And this was just one of the rooms that had graffiti on it. And we were just laughing with the real estate agent, kind of staring at the wall in awe that to be able to see a room where the tenant before graffitied the wall before they left. The real estate agent was a little bit embarrassed, I think, showing us this room. But we ended up choosing this room because it was such the lighting was good in the room and we really liked the room anyway. But yeah, basically we ended up living in that exact apartment. Yeah, so it was basically a few months of waiting for it to be, cleaned up and renovated, I guess, getting rid of the graffiti and covering up all the holes in the room. It was really cool to see that there was someone who graffitied the walls of the apartment that we were living in before we moved in, so that was kind of cool. And I think one of the main things that a lot of people are curious about when moving into a poorer area of Japan is the aspect of safety and crime. And in my experience of living in Shin-Imamiya, which is known to be one of the poorest areas of Kansai, I think a lot of people might think that there's a lot of crime because there's a lot of homeless people in Shin-Imamiya and poorer areas, but that's actually not the truth when it comes to Japan, because from my experience, homeless people in Japan and homeless people in, let's say, America is very different. And that stems from the culture. Japanese culture is so ingrained into everyone in Japan, including the homeless people, that it's just a very different personality that a lot of the homeless people have compared to somewhere like America. When I lived in San Francisco a few years ago, I remember being aggressively asked for money, and there was this one time where I gave a homeless man some money and he actually grabbed me asking for more money. And that's the type of thing that can happen in America, obviously not all the time. But in Japan, it's a very different culture because even homeless people in Japan seem to not want to draw attention to themselves or make other people feel uncomfortable, especially if they're asking for money. And most of the time, they don't even ask for money. They just, they're doing their own thing. And all the times that I lived in Shin-Imamiya, I don't think I was ever approached even once by a homeless man. Even when you offer them money, sometimes they'll refuse it, which is a bit crazy because I remember one time there was a man that I tried to give a few $100 100 yens that I had in my pocket, and he just refused it. He says, oh, no, I don't want it, and then he just went off. But this was in my experience that I was able to see in Japan, that homeless people aren't necessarily the reason why you should feel uncomfortable or feel like you're in danger in Japan. There's this one story that I like to tell all my friends. So within the very first month, I remember it was a very hot day, and I had the door of our apartment cracked open because the air conditioning wasn't working. So we had the door opened, and I could hear a bit of like a skin-to-skin slapping sound. And I thought it was weird. I was like, oh, what's that sound? And, I just ignored it for a few minutes. I still heard repetitive slapping sound. And I started to get a bit intrigued. I was like, oh, what's that sound? I don't think it's a TV, because it just sounded so loud and real. So I kind of like poked my head out a bit and then listened a bit more, and I could hear the slapping sound from right under our apartment. And I realized that it was like like someone being slapped, and I was like, oh, whoa, someone's, I wonder if someone's getting beaten up or something. And I was about to go out just to kind of check it out, but so before I went down, I just wanted to make sure and listen in one more time, and I could hear like obviously a Japanese man, and he was grunting. He was saying, "Ora, kane wa, kane wa." He was saying, money, where's the money? And in Japanese, and I was like, oh, this could be like a yakuza type thing. And I realized, like, I was listening, and that's basically what it was. It was a man who essentially, our neighbor downstairs, who was borrowing money for pachinko or whatever it was. And basically having a money lender come collect the debts that he borrowed. And that's the type of building that we lived in. And that wasn't the only time. I have a few other stories of that happening. A similar story where something shady was happening in the building or near where we were living. And that's the type of place that really encompasses our apartment and our life in Japan. There was a lot of inspiring things, like being able to open the door and we would hear the nightlife of, drunk Japanese men salarymen going home from work after going to a bar, or a group of high schoolers just, cackling, going home from school, and just you get a really strong vibe of what Japan is, because it just felt really real, a genuine part of Japan, and not like a sugar-coated anime type thing. It was basically, it felt like it was the real life that anime is based on, and that's something that I felt really strongly while living in Shin-Imamiya, and I've never felt anywhere else living in Japan. And I think it's because it has to do with the people that live there, whether it be for the positive or the negative. There's obviously a lot of dark things that happen in those areas. Like I was saying, the things, whether it be addiction or, money, financial problems, and people living there for that reason. But at the same time, you do really feel like what's happening there's a lot of togetherness, a lot of community feeling, a lot of oji-chan, oba-chan, like older men and women, kind of just sparking up conversation with each other. And even to me, ever since I moved away, I always look fondly on the memories of living in a very poor area like Shin-Imamiya. I hope you like this video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye.